Welcome, everyone. I hope you enjoyed lunch. I hope you enjoyed New Brunswick, New Jersey, which could be its own case study of trying to balance redevelopment and preserving historic and cultural fabric. My name is David Listokin. I'm a professor at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. I teach preservation there. I've taught preservation at Harvard and Cornell universities. I have to compliment Archer. I'm putting together a wonderful, wonderful conference, and actually the Blaustein School and CHAPS has had a terrific collaboration. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our afternoon keynote speaker, Dr. Stephanie Smith Toothman of the National Park Service. They do an annual survey amongst the public how different federal agencies are viewed, and not surprisingly, the Internal Revenue Service collects the taxes is not too popular. What is the most popular federal agency is the National Park Service. And it's not just held in high regard by the general public. The NPS is crucial for realizing historic preservation in the United States. If I could just cite two telling statistics. The NPS has oversight on the National Register of Historic Places, which has over 80,000 entries and 1 million historic resources. It also has oversight over the Federal Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit, which cumulatively has resulted in $100 billion worth of historic rehabilitation. Now, your conference packet has a full description of our keynote speaker, so I'm just going to highlight some accomplishments. Dr. Toothman is Associate Director for Cultural Resources at the National Park Service. She earned her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Toothman is responsible for history, historic preservation, and cultural programs in 392 national parks and a host of related community programs. She also manages the National Native American Graves Protection Act, as well as the National Heritage Area Program. So without further ado, if we can give a warm welcome to our afternoon keynote speaker.
Thank you, David, for that introduction and just how fast things move in the National Park Service. On October 8th, President Obama actually announced, under the authority of the Antiquities Act, our 398th National Park Unit, which, as was mentioned earlier, commemorates the contributions of Cesar Chavez and the struggles to unionize in the agricultural labor field. So I can predict with some certainty that by this time next year will be well over 400, given the number of other sites that we're working on. Another just little known fact, I'm going to try to get this at the right place for my voice, is that over 2/3 of our units are designated for historic purposes, and sometimes we get lost, as in the Ken Burns series with the focus on Yosemite and Yellowstone. My reply to that is they too are cultural landscapes. So with that, I just want to say it's a particular honor to speak to you today, representing the United States National Park Service and the Department of the Interior at this event that is helping to mark both the 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention and, as we've heard several times today, the 20th anniversary of the recognition of cultural landscapes as part of that convention. I also want to thank Rutgers University for hosting that conference and to the co-sponsors for their support. And I'm delighted that we were able to be one of those, as I believe that the international dialogue that this conference represents is critical. I'm also personally delighted to be part of this because, given the tenor and the expertise represented this morning, I know this is going to be a conference that I walk away with a lot more information than I'm going to impart to you today. So I want to thank all of my colleagues who will be up here at some point for that. Through this type of exchange, we can all benefit from the innovations and experiences of others. And this is a particularly valuable opportunity, not only for myself, but my staff of the National Park Service Cultural Landscapes Program, to share the challenges and ideas with their international counterparts. Several of the leaders who created and have sustained our cultural landscape programs are participating in the conference. You've already heard from Bob Page and Nora Mitchell, who made important contributions, as did Ethan Carr in the past. And tomorrow you'll be hearing from our current national program leader, Susan Dolan. So, and I want to thank Susan for her leadership in getting us involved with the conference. I look forward to our discussion following my remarks this afternoon, and I want to invite them to join me in responding to questions you may have about our programs. As this is the 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, I'm proud to reflect upon the National Park Service's international engagement in crafting of the World Heritage Convention. In the 1960s and 1970s, we played a key role in promoting and developing the initial concept of the World Heritage List. Congressman Joseph L. Fisher and the recently deceased and mourned Russell Train were critical players in a 1965 White House conference on international cooperation, at which the notion of a World Heritage Trust was first proposed to protect natural and scenic areas and historic sites. This was the first proposal to call for combining natural and cultural heritage under the same convention. The National Park Service and the Department of the Interior later took major roles in the negotiations that led to UNESCO's adoption of the World Heritage Convention in 1972, and to the U.S. to become the first country to ratify it by a unanimous vote by the Senate in 1973. And I can assure you we don't see too many unanimous votes on anything these days. The National Park Service has, from its early years, incorporated both natural and cultural sites into the system and has developed policies to manage them as such. I'm going to stop here because this is not only probably one of the longest, but one of the more trickiest. Papahanaumokuakea, a recent inscription on the World Heritage List in 2010, which is up here, is a wonderful example of a mixed natural and cultural site, and also an associative cultural landscape. It is a vast and isolated cluster of small, low-lying islands and atolls and their surrounding ocean, approximately 250 kilometers to the northwest of the main Hawaiian archipelago. The area has a deep cosmological and traditional significance for living Hawaiian culture as the place where life originates and to where the spirits return after death. Papahanaumokuakea is also one of the largest marine protected areas in the world. Several U.S. properties inscribed on the World Heritage List in the past, before the category of cultural landscapes was recognized in 1992, are also cultural landscapes, such as Chaco culture in New Mexico, Mesa Verde in Colorado, Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and the University of Virginia. Yosemite National Park in California, designated as a World Heritage Site in 1984 for exceptional natural value, is also a cultural landscape, listed on the National Register about 10 years ago. Set aside as the first national park in 1864 for its outstanding scenic beauty, it has become recognized as a place where American Indians have settled and manipulated the landscape for thousands of years, as well as a significant place in the history of early wilderness tourism, the origins of the National Park Service's park rustic architectural vernacular, and naturalistic landscape architectural principles, and the national parks and conservation movements. Today, the park is managed to sustain both the natural and cultural values that are inextricably intertwined and beyond its boundaries. And as an aside, I'll say that one of the big issues that we are dealing with right now in Yosemite is just that factor of how do we balance the values of a wild and scenic river designation and this unit of the Merced River that passes through the valley with the outstanding cultural values that we've also recognized in the valley. And it has been the source of years of litigation, and probably will be more, but we are trying our best to resolve it. But it is a very challenging issue, as you all know in your own cases. Several properties on the U.S. World Heritage Tentative List are natural park cultural landscapes, such as the ancient American Indian constructions at Poverty Point in Louisiana, the Hopewell sites in Ohio, and the San Antonio Franciscan missions in Texas. In the brief time that I have today, I'd like to give you a sense of the broad reach of the work of the U.S. National Park Service in cultural heritage, and in cultural landscapes in particular, as the quote-unquote cultural ministry in the U.S. I'm not sure how my friends at the Smithsonian would be regarding me using that label, but we'll go with it today. Second, to identify some of the current trends and the challenges and opportunities relevant to our discussion. And third, to share some ideas on what we need to do to strengthen our efforts both nationally and internationally. So first, I'd like to look at us as the U.S.'s cultural ministry. The role of the National Park Service as the leading cultural ministry of the United States federal government has its origins in our founding legislation. Our Organic Act of 1916, which defined the purpose of the agency to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. A built-in conundrum in terms of how you balance both use and preservation that we continue to deal with on a daily basis, every day. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 gave the National Park Service the lead federal role as the designated representative of the Secretary of the Interior in establishing a national historic preservation program of parks and heritage resources throughout the country so that, and again I quote, the historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people, end quote. Today, the National Park Service's responsibilities have grown to include 398 national parks, all of which are cultural landscapes in the broadest definition of having both natural and cultural resources and having been shaped by thousands of years of human interaction. Our responsibilities also include the management of many preservation programs that reach beyond park boundaries, and David mentioned the National Register of Historic Places, the National Historic Landmarks Program, which focuses on nationally significant sites with the highest level of integrity, and national heritage areas. These and many others comprise a host of community assistance programs that make up the National Park Service's role in a national preservation partnership among federal, tribal, state, and local governments and nonprofits, including the National Trust, and you heard from Barb today. The National Park Service also manages the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and maintains an extensive national system of standards known as the Secretary of the Interior Standards, which provide guidance and technical assistance that are the foundation of historic preservation work across the country, including standards and guidelines for managing cultural landscapes. These programs and the National Park System together form a vital part of the National Park Service mission and help to sustain and enhance the quality of life throughout America. These programs and national parks rely on a spirit of partnership and cooperation, which I believe must be the hallmark of the National Park Service and World Heritage efforts in the decades that lie ahead. The National Park Service took a national leadership role in cultural landscape preservation in 1980 when the agency founded the Park Cultural Landscapes Program and began developing preservation standards for landscapes. I mentioned some of the leaders, but one name that I haven't mentioned yet who also deserves substantial credit was Hugh Miller, who as chief park architect was a very strong proponent and managed to convince a very dubious NPS leadership to let him proceed. Hugh continues to be a very active proponent of cultural landscapes in his mentorship of numerous students through the Goucher Historic Preservation Program, and we are currently co-mentoring a student who's looking at National Park Service policies and attitudes towards wilderness, a very hot topic, as Barb mentioned, in terms of differing perspectives on how wilderness should be managed. And if you really want to throw a hot ember into the crowd, just say wilderness is a cultural construct and stand back. I think we're getting there. As Bob said, we are really moving forward in terms of our understanding that natural and cultural aren't separate values, aren't separate disciplines, but prosper and when they are looked at and when our research is approached in an interdisciplinary manner that combines the questions and attributes of both research. These programs and national parks rely on a spirit of partnership. Oh, I've said that. Sorry, I lost my place. The National Park Service first officially recognized cultural landscapes as a resource type in the National Park Service Cultural Resource Management Guideline in 1981. At the same time, cultural landscapes were being considered by the World Heritage Committee, and as we've heard several times today, were eventually recognized in 1992. Reflecting a similar approach to the World Heritage System, the definition of National Park Service cultural landscapes is broad, from designed to vernacular to ethnographic landscapes, or associative in World Heritage language. These three types of landscapes mirror those in the World Heritage Committee's operational guidelines for implementation of the World Heritage Convention. In the US, vernacular and ethnographic or associative cultural landscapes in particular have presented new challenges for NPS management. Vernacular landscapes are particularly challenging as they are most often significant for their historic or traditional use, such as mining, logging, farming, and ranching, and in some cases these uses are ongoing. We in the National Park Service are challenged to perpetuate these land uses of vernacular landscapes in a way that also retains their historic character. For me to make that statement that we are actually trying to perpetuate those landscapes and maintain historic character is, again, a major evolution from where we were 20 years ago when Cuyahoga Valley came into the system, and our immediate response was to buy everything up, clear out the people who lived there, and then say, oh my goodness, now what do we do? Who maintains this? So we've learned lessons over the years, and one of those is that we can live with a living landscape. And in the case of Eby's Landing National Historic Reserve in Washington State, and there's a picture of it here, and another one here, or the Cuyahoga Valley in National Park in Ohio, it has been critical to use management strategies that are developed with local communities and support the economics of farming to sustain these important cultural landscapes. As I said, that's not an understanding that we went into these parks with, but it's certainly one that we've learned through trial and error over the past 3 decades. In the case of ethnographic or associative landscapes, it has been important to recognize the values and meanings and uses that communities and tribes associate with the landscape, and to develop cooperative relationships based on trust in order to effectively collaborate on the future management of these landscapes. many of which are designated as traditional cultural properties and carry with them ongoing uses that require tremendous sensitivity and collaboration with the traditional communities that use them. One example of cooperation is at Canyon de Chelly in New Mexico and Arizona, where the land is owned by the Navajo Nation, and the Navajos have, since the 1930s, helped manage this cultural landscape, providing interpretation and in coordination with the National Park Service. At Death Valley National Park in California, a portion of the national park that was homeland for the Tambisha Shoshone tribe is now co-managed between the tribe and the National Park Service. At Lake Mead National Recreation Area in Nevada, 4 tribes are associated with a traditional cultural property, including the Mojave, the Hualapai, and the Southern Paiute tribes. At Glen Canyon National Recreation Area in Utah, the National Park Service staff is working with the Mormon community on 2 traditional cultural property nominations, one for communities associated with the Mormon Trail, the other for Hole in the Rock, a historic campsite along the trail with spiritual significance. In addition to our role in managing these ethnographic landscapes, we developed guidance for identifying and documenting traditional cultural properties, also known as Bulletin 38, for use of our federal, state, local, and tribal partners in their efforts to protect these properties from adverse effects. We are currently engaged in extensive consultations to assess the effectiveness and need for revision of these guidelines after 20 years of use in the field. And I will mention as an aside that this is an issue, or the decision to look at these guidelines grew partly out of the kind of situation that Barbara Paul described this morning, and that with the tremendous push under this administration to approve huge renewable energy projects, the situation that she described where you had these huge landscapes of traditional significance being pockmarked by leases and technically avoiding archaeological sites, the tribes with which we consult have said we've had enough. This is not acceptable. We need to be able to have guidance that really ensures that we can recognize these landscapes. And in addition to consulting on how we define traditional cultural properties, we will also be undertaking an effort to look at adding cultural landscapes as a new property type to the National Register of Historic Places criteria. I believe very strongly that this is appropriate, and that years of trying to shoehorn cultural landscapes, whether they be ethnographic or designed, into a historic site or district designation just doesn't work. So Susan Dolan has initiated those conversations, and they'll be part of a larger look at how we use the National Register criteria. I'd also like to look at trends and challenges and opportunities. We in the National Park Service are now preparing for the 100th anniversary of the service in 2016, as you heard, and we are reflecting on how to best prepare the agency for the future. You also heard that the 2016 is the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act. Last year, the National Park Service's director published a call to action to prepare us for the next 100 years of stewardship and engagement. We are also preparing to release a Cultural Resources Challenge, a 21st century vision for National Park Service cultural resources stewardship and leadership. Many themes in the call to action and the challenge reflect the themes that we're hearing here today on the 40th anniversary of the convention. In particular, the emphasis on the critical role of local communities, the importance of sustainability in our approach to stewardship, and the spirit of partnership and cooperation in all of our undertakings. Cultural landscapes offer many opportunities as the concept has broadened to become more inclusive of many values and many perspectives. But among our many challenges, not the least of which are fiscal challenges as we face possible sequestration and continual cuts over the foreseeable future, is the need to engage with more of the American people and maintain the relevancy of important places in their lives. In other words, to enhance the usefulness of conservation to America's quality of life and community vitality. So what do we need to do to strengthen our efforts both nationally and internationally and to achieve some of this vision? Most importantly, more community engagement is needed, particularly with more diverse communities, leading to an expansion of the relevance of the National Park Service and cultural landscape preservation to all Americans. This fall, we will release a national thematic study of American Latinos in their role in the shaping of the Americas and more particularly the United States over the past 500 years. This study brings together essays from 15 of the top Latino American scholars in the U.S. and will provide a framework for identifying and protecting sites, structures, and landscapes associated with this history, both within the national parks and in communities throughout the U.S. But it will not be successful if we don't find a way to successfully engage both the leaders of this community, of these communities, and the folks every day who are responsible for taking care of these resources. Over the next years, we will launch similar efforts starting this year with updating our thematic study of the history of women and embarking on a thematic overview of Asian Pacific Islanders' experiences in the U.S. All of these are in recognition that the vast cultural landscape of the United States has been shaped by both its indigenous people and centuries of immigration and settlement by people from all over the world. Secondly, we need to engage youth in new ways, offering place-based education, the use of media, but also a ladder of engagement. A good example of one of these programs is the Olmsted Center's Olmsted Center's Branching Out program, which offers job training in horticulture and arboriculture for young people in the Boston area. Another example is our Vanishing Treasures program and our Southwest parks, which offer preservation building skills training to youth in national parks, in 40 national parks. Another program involves the Student Conservation Association, which provides internships for an array of conservation efforts in the parks. We will be working in urban areas such as New York City to develop other opportunities for the preservation of traditional skills, including landscape, within their vocational education system. We are working on developing a high school within the New York City system to focus on those traditional skills. Third, we need to recognize that we need to work at a larger scale such as national heritage areas already represent, and we need to push for greater integration with national heritage research and conservation efforts. Many opportunities exist for national parks to anchor larger geographic areas or conservation corridors to connect significant places of natural and cultural heritage and to involve federal, tribal, state, and local partners. At this scale, the National Park Service can be a partner in governance alongside others. We are fortunate to have the existing national heritage areas as living demonstrations of how well these partnerships can work to preserve multiple layers of heritage within a geographic area. Our director, John Jarvis, has made it a top legislative priority to formalize the system of heritage areas and provide a foundation for their long-term sustainability. We both agree that if national heritage areas didn't exist, we would be looking to invent a similar model to support management of these cultural landscapes. Another initiative, the Secretary's America's Great Outdoors Initiative, and the recent National Park Service report, Leopold report. Actually, it's called the it's actually a National Park Service Advisory Board Science Committee's report, and it's called Leopold Revisited. If you are familiar with NPS natural resource management practices, the Leopold report has been kind of the go-to document and probably the source of greatest anxiety and concern among their natural resource counterparts because of its vision of restoring our parks to some vague concept of primeval pre-European America. Well, fortunately, the Leopold Revisited promotes and supports greater integration of natural and cultural research and integration, and recognizes, again, that the landscapes that we manage are cultural landscapes and that we can only manage them informed by both natural and cultural information. Another area is building sustainability. Our ability to preserve cultural landscapes in perpetuity is inextricably tied to achieving sustainable stewardship. Bob talked about this on a small scale, but this is true whether we're talking within our boundaries or in the larger landscapes that our parks exist. It is critical to recognize sustainability as a trifold concept as defined by the United Nations of environmental, economic, and social durability. This too requires sustained partnerships and adaptability in a rapidly changing world. And finally, as this conference and others have demonstrated, when we need to be continually innovating and adapting to changing circumstances, it is critical to continue this type of international dialogue. We have any number of examples of programs such as the U.S. ICOMOS Internship Program and the National Park Service's Office of International Affairs Fellowships, and of organizations such as IUCN and ICOMOS that demonstrate that professional networks can be successfully accomplished through cooperation between governments, NGOs, and universities, as we see at this conference. So with that, I'd like to close and wish you all a very rewarding conference experience. I certainly am having one, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we quickly take one or two questions before we move on to the afternoon panel. Anyone has questions?
I think we're still shuffling.
Okay.
A quick question. You pointed to the fact that you'll be releasing a cultural resources challenge in the upcoming future. Could you briefly expand upon that and give us a notion as to the timetable, please?
Well, the word challenge carries a number of meanings with National Park Service folks because of the natural resources challenge that occurred in the 2000s, which created a whole new framework for natural resource management in the Park Service and a $78 million base increase. Obviously, that's what I would like to be presenting, but the realities of the budget have made us step back and focus on how can we use the resources that we have in the most productive and focused manner. And so several of the goals of the challenge are to really focus on knowing what we have, what the threats are, and what our opportunities are for responding to those threats. They also, and that's within the parks, but also the challenge focuses on supporting and strengthening the partnerships that are mandated and which are so important to our own work through the National Historic Preservation Act. So some of the challenge recommendations focus on strengthening those partnerships. The challenge recognizes that whether you're the National Park Service or a state park or a private landowner, those fundamental precepts of knowing what you have and what the threats are and what your options are for responding to them are common to all. So again, the emphasis is not only on the park side, but on the partnership side. There's a number of very specific actions associated with that, which I won't go into here, but it will be out in the next month or so, assuming it gets through all the various approvals. So it focuses on also building a new generation of cultural resource managers within the park system. Many of us are on the verge of retirement within the next year or the next 5 years. So there'll be a tremendous turnover, and we're really looking at how we can work with our academic colleagues to really recruit and build a new workforce within the National Park Service and within our fellow federal and state and local agencies, as well as in the private sector that can really carry the torch into the next generation. So those are some of the areas that we're looking at, but I would say the overall vision is one that understands that we are one national historic preservation program. It's not the Park Service and everybody else, but that we're part of a continuum and that we have responsibilities both for stewardship of the national park system, but also for being a collaborative leader for all of the many partners that have matured over the last 50 years, and make sure that we're supporting them in any way that we can.
Thank you very much.